I'm Carole Taylor. In this episode of Journal, I'm going to put my previous hat of finance minister back on and let off a little steam about the trends I'm seeing, BC, Ottawa, around the world, where deficits and debt don't seem to matter anymore. But you know personally that if you and your household spend more than you have, over time the consequences can be severe. I remember being on a news panel a few years ago analyzing a federal budget and cautioning that a continual buildup of debt is dangerous because eventually interest rates will go up and the cost to government will be substantial. Well, a fellow panelist disagreed, and he was very dismissive, saying that my thoughts were old thinking, that in fact the government should borrow just as much as they can because money was free and rates weren't going to go up in the way I feared. Guess what? Hasn't taken government long to experience the pain. After years of building up debt with no serious talk about balancing the budget, interest rates on that debt have gone up. Already in the last federal budget, the interest on this so-called free money is costing almost the same as the spending on healthcare transfers to all of our provinces. In other words, 10% of revenue is not going to childcare, not to defense, not to the green economy, or anything else you care about, but it's going to the banks to pay for our past borrowing. One man who's been sounding the alarm for many years on this issue is Jock Finlayson, one of Canada's top economists and a political advisor to many finance ministers, including me. Back in a moment when we will examine why you should care about governments running up these bills that our children will have to pay. We're back with Jock Finlayson, and I have to say, we've become friends over the years, but Jock, you just said to me, I'm like a dog with a bone when I'm talking about debt and deficits.
Yes, it's one of your favorite topics, I've observed.
So how can we bring it to life? I mean, how do you make people individually or as a family care about what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a real conundrum in today's social media environment. You know, I was reflecting the other day that I was in Ottawa in the early 1990s when Canada kind of hit the wall. I always remember the Wall Street Journal editorial saying Canada was running out of money, and they described our currency as a northern peso, and that really got the attention of the decision makers in Ottawa. And it was shortly after that Prime Minister Chrétien and Finance Minister Paul Martin determined that they were going to address this fiscal problem head on. And they undertook, some very controversial, painful actions that really put Canada on a very different trajectory for fiscal consolidation, sharp reductions in the size of the federal debt measured against the economy. And we were actually a world leader in fixing our fiscal problems. And the environment was so different in those days. I remember Mr. Chrétien, his main opposition party was the Reform Party in the House of Commons. And on every issue involving government spending, except agricultural subsidies, their tendency was to say, cut deeper, cut faster, bring the budget into balance even more quickly than you're planning to. We don't hear that very much of that today from any of the political parties, including the ones on the right. So I think something quite fundamental has changed in what I would describe as the political economy of government budgeting in Canada. The public just is not seized with the issue of government finances today in the way they were certainly in the 1990s, but also when you were in government here in British Columbia, which was kind of the early 2000s. It was a different time. And the priorities seem to have really shifted the public's priorities seem to have really shifted in a significant way. And that partly explains why I think we're in the situation we are today, where there's an awful lot of red ink being spilt across the whole Canadian public sector.
But the big point you're making, and it's a good reminder to all of us, when you've got a huge ship like Canada, and it's going in this direction of just building up debt and deficits, it's very hard to turn around. And I remember John Manley, who used to be minister of just about everything, but he was minister of industry when Chrétien decided to take this on. And John said, the prime minister called him in and he said, "John, your budget's cut in half." And John Manley says, oh, I've got hundreds of programs supporting industry. Cut in half. And it was that severe. I mean, health transfers to the province got cut, CBC got cut, everything got cut. And as you say, the public probably wouldn't stand for it these days.
Yeah. And Mr. Chrétien's government, I mean, they were elected a couple other times after undertaking this kind of epic fiscal consolidation austerity. They were rewarded for it by Canadians with majority governments again and again up until I guess 2003. So they had a whole decade while Chrétien was prime minister. So it didn't seem to hurt them, even though they were taking pretty draconian action. Just to put it in context, I mean, in those days, the government of Canada, the debt was at the peak was at 70% of Canada's gross domestic product. Today, the federal debt, today we're at 42%. It's gone up quite a bit since the pandemic, but it's still, very significantly lower than it was in that period. Second, the federal government was spending 30 cents of every dollar of revenue that it collected just on debt servicing costs. And today we're at 10 or 11 cents. And it's gone up. It's doubled under Trudeau Jr., but it's still quite a bit lower than it was. And then interest rates in those days were both in market interest rates, but also the real inflation-adjusted interest rate both those were much higher than they are today. So even though rates have gone up in Canada, the true sort of burden of servicing debt compared to those days is still quite a bit less on a per dollar basis. So we have quite a bit more running room, I think, before we get into any kind of a fiscal crisis. But in my personal view, not everybody shares it. But the trend lines are certainly alarming that we're seeing today.
And I guess what you're saying is we've got time to take action here if we remember history and if we don't want to head down that extreme path. But the other thing in the atmosphere that I see is that politicians used to at least pretend to care about this. There'd be a couple of words in the budget saying, in 5 years or 3 years, we're headed towards a balanced budget and surplus, and they never got there, but the words were there. I don't think they're even pretending anymore. I don't hear anybody even talking about it.
Well, maybe they're being honest, that they actually have no intention of prioritizing what I would describe as sustainable public finance. I mean, if you want to be a cynic about it, I mean, just think through the incentive structure facing any elected government. The incentive is always to spend more than you're collecting in revenue because the debt you're going to build up is somebody else's problem down the road. And I actually think that calculus is quite explicitly guiding some of the decision making today. The real puzzle is why it didn't, 2 or 3 decades ago. And I think it's because we were in worse shape. We were in kind of a crisis or approaching a crisis situation. And so people and the public was more animated and concerned. I remember when I moved to Vancouver from Ottawa, I think it was 1994, and one of the first things I saw was the Vancouver Board of Trade debt clock down at Canada Place. I remember going for a walk and seeing this thing. I couldn't believe it. It was a gimmick, but it was powerful as a community, and it just showed the rise in dollars every second of the then accumulated. Today, if they were going to bring it out again, they'd have to expand it because there'd be more digits in the size of the debt. We're up in the trillions now rather than the hundreds of billions. But they did that because they sensed, I think, a public interest in the issue. Today, I don't see that at all. If you look at the mandate letters that prime ministers and premiers give to their ministers after an election, and I'm one of the few people who probably reads those. So I read the ones that Premier Eby gave to his ministers after he became premier, and I read the mandate letters that Mr. Trudeau gave to his ministers after the election in 2021. And it's fair to say that fiscal sustainability, balancing budgets were nowhere to be found as even a second or third order priority in those mandate letters. The priorities were around housing, reconciliation, climate change, recently cost of living pressures that are bearing down on households, anti-racism initiatives here in BC have taken on quite a bit of priority. healthcare, obviously, but not public finances and not the economy either, generally. So I view that, I'm not a political expert, I view that as the politicians responding to what they see the public caring about. And these days, the public seems more concerned with the kind of things I just mentioned than they are with whether the government is running a budget deficit or a surplus.
And I agree with you completely that the tendency is to say, well, that's going to be somebody else's problem. Like, for sure, Justin Trudeau, even if he runs and wins again, but it's not going to be his problem to solve. It's going to be someone down the line where it gets really into a crisis situation that has to start dealing with it, so they can be casual about it. But the other point you make about public interest has to change before the politicians, like politicians will follow that. So how do we explain or talk about it in a way that the average person sitting at home goes, oh, I get it. You mean my kid's going to have to pay for this? Or how do we get that message out there?
Well, there are lots of people that would be better equipped than me to respond to that, who are sort of experts on how you communicate to the public. That's not my forte, but I do think it's going to have to be around the theme of intergenerational equity. I found the 2024 Trudeau government budget, which trumpeted the theme of generational equity, totally laughable on that count, because that budget was all about deferring, in effect,
And we're going to defer the actual explanation of how we're going to deal with this. Back in a moment. Welcome back. You know, Jock, as we were talking about all of this issue, I remember in finance when the rating agencies were about to come out and sort of judge your budget from an investment point of view. And you'd hold your breath and hold your breath and, oh, we kept our AAA. Well, recently we saw provincially, S&P, Standard & Poor, this is their third downgrade of this government's finances, down to AA minus, and also took down their outlook to negative outlook. Yep. Now, Moody's, they left AAA, but they downgraded their outlook again. Yeah. But you know what? The press didn't really cover it, and the politicians, if they were asked, rarely about it, they just sort of said, well, the whole world's got problems. Do these rating agencies not matter anymore?
Well, they matter. I mean, we have to be clear. They took a big blow to their reputation during the global financial crisis of 2007, 8, and 9, when a lot of the securities they were rating, particularly debt securities, blew up, even though some of them had, very, very high ratings. So I don't think people listen to them as much as they might have, 10 or 15 years ago. But I read the Standard & Poor's report on BC, and like you, I've read a number of these over the years. It was the language they used was quite striking. It was more alarmist than I'd ever seen before in the context of British Columbia, and looking at the trend lines and hinting that there's probably more downgrades to come going forward. The public, again, I don't think is seized with that issue today. And I think it's because we've gone through a cost of living mini crisis. I think in Canada, there's a lot of households that are really stressed financially, especially in this province. We've got issues that did not exist in the early 1990s, or even when you were in government, in quite the same way. The priority of, dealing with climate change, the Canadian push for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This isn't just some side issue. It's become central to everything governments are doing, from what I've observed. We didn't have a housing affordability crisis in Canada in the early 1990s or the early 2000s, but now apparently we do. There's only so much bandwidth in politics to deal with priorities, and these things seem to have emerged as the priorities. And issues like public finances, jobs, which really, unemployment was really a big driver of a lot of the political debate in Canada when I was early in my career. It's not the case today to the same extent. In fact, we've had labor shortages. So I think there's really been a shift in the landscape, and I see the politicians responding to what they perceive as the public's priorities. So until the public gets seized with government budgeting as a top priority issue, I don't expect to see much change in Canada,
Well,
unfortunately.
out of the Bank of Canada, we're hearing words like emergency, talking about the state of the economy in Canada, and various commentators, whether it's David Dodge or Manley or yourself or even Mark Carney a little bit, are starting to say, hey, we better think about growth in this country. So maybe we can bring it back to individual families if instead of we talk about GDP, which the Prime Minister correctly says GDP's gone up, but that doesn't mean wealth for families. So you talk about GDP per capita.
Yeah.
Explain why you're going
Sure.
there.
Well, any economy that has rapid population growth, there'll be more spending because think of it through the immigration lens. Every new person that arrives in BC or Canada becomes a consumer of goods and services. Most of them get employed, so they have an income of some sort. They all need housing. They all need personal transportation. So there's demand stimulated in the economy for goods and services just because of the growth in the population. The issue is, does the extra economic output, GDP, produced by a bigger population grow faster than the denominator, which is the size of the population? And in Canada right now, we're in what I would describe as a bad equilibrium, where we've got, yes, the economy's growing, but it's not growing fast enough to keep up with the population adjusted for inflation. So we're actually getting less prosperous over time.
For families, individual families.
Sure. Well, think of it as a family. If your spending exceeds your income growth, if your growth in spending exceeds your growth in income, your debt's going to be built up. And that's exactly kind of what's happening in Canada and British Columbia today, and has been for a while. Debt is fine if you've got growing revenues, growing incomes, whether you're a corporation or a household or a country. But it becomes more challenging if the debt's growing faster than your ability to service it or the income that you're generating. And that's kind of where we're at today in Canada, which is why this trend line we're on over the long term is not sustainable. I don't see a near-term crisis. I want to be clear about that. But kind of projecting out through the end of the decade on where we're headed in government finances, it's definitely concerning.
So what should government do to try and concentrate more on growth?
Sure. Well, the debate about why our economy is not performing well goes well beyond the realm of public finances. It has to do with, productivity, the scaling of businesses. Investment is really the fundamental problem in the private sector in Canada.
So why has it gone down?
Well, I mean, Canada is not as attractive as a place to deploy capital as we were when you were in government or even in the 1990s. I mean, the data is crystal clear on that. And a lot of our policymakers are very reluctant to kind of take it on because it doesn't speak well of their economic management of the country. But our Canadian business, excluding housing, what we call non-residential investment, Canadian business overall is not investing enough to even keep up with depreciation of the existing capital assets. So we're, in the language of my late grandfather, who was a rancher, we're eating the seed corn, kind of in terms of capital formation in Canada. And it's an area where we're lagging compared to a lot of other countries. So if I was in government, I would be, and I wanted to grow the economy faster, I wouldn't do it the way Trudeau's doing it, which is to stimulate more spending and consumption and public sector growth. That, in my view, is a dead end in terms of the eventual outcome. But if we want to grow our productive economy, one of the things we need to do is accelerate capital formation by business. And that requires looking closely at where we're competitive, where we're not competitive, making adjustments. Probably the single worst area in Canada is our regulatory systems around large-scale projects. We are literally one of the worst in the world in terms of the complexity and cost and time that's associated with getting anything built. And it goes all the way down to the World Bank had a report ranking Canada near the bottom in the time it takes to get a permit to build a warehouse, on a piece of industrial property. Like, it's throughout the whole supply chain in Canada, we seem to be very, very slow to get stuff built when we decide we're going to build something. And that doesn't cost a lot of money to fix, by the way, but it requires all sort of levels of government to prioritize efficiency in regulatory decision-making. So that's one thing we could do that would, I think, really make a difference.
It's interesting when economists, or we, talk about productivity. I think that scares a lot of people because it sounds like, oh, so you want me to work longer and harder, and I'm, I'm hardly able to keep my family afloat. That's not what you mean by
No,
productivity.
productivity is the value, labor productivity is the value of what we produce per hour of work. And how many hours people want to work, that's a different choice that they can make. And some of the most productive economies in the world are actually the Scandinavian economies, where the work week is even smaller than it is in Canada and certainly in the United States. But they're extremely productive in the value of what they're producing in every hour of work. And that to me is the sweet spot. That's what we want to aim for. We're not interested in building a sweatshop economy where people are working 50 or 60 hours a week. But it goes back to the investment. How do workers become more productive other than through their own human capital, building up their skills and experience? By having better capital equipment to work with, more tools, more up-to-date technologies. That's how people become more productive in the workplace. And to get there, you need an environment where your companies will invest more in things that make workers productive. So that's the way I would frame the investment challenge.
So investment in technology and also investment at home, because we both know companies that are investing, but it's in other places, not Canada.
Yeah.
So we have to leave it like that, and next time we'll talk about taxes.
Okay. I'll make sure I'll wear a dark suit then as well.
Thank you, Jock. Jock Finlayson, back in a moment. A recent poll conducted by Nanos surprisingly found that 63% of Canadians felt that the government should cut spending and use those dollars to either pay down debt or cut taxes. Well, if this polling holds, maybe governments won't be so successful at buying support through announcement after announcement after announcement of spending. Who knows? Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.